The Portland Memorial Coliseum was in chaos on the evening of April 27, 1975. Outside, 18,000 fans who'd paid for tickets stood in the cold spring rain, unable to enter the building. Inside, the venue was completely empty, except for a handful of technicians, security guards, and Elvis's road crew. A catastrophic failure in the arena's new computerized ticketing system had locked every entrance, and despite 2 hours of frantic effort, nobody could get the doors open. Elvis Presley stood backstage in his white jumpsuit, warming up his voice, completely unaware of the disaster unfolding. His tour manager, Joe Esposito, was trying to decide how to break the news. The show was supposed to start in 15 minutes, but there was no audience to perform for. The logical decision was obvious: cancel the show, refund the tickets, reschedule for another night. It was a technical failure, an act of God, nobody's fault. The fans would understand. But Joe knew Elvis wouldn't see it that way. Elvis had been struggling lately, dealing with health problems and prescription medications and the exhaustion of constant touring. Some shows had been disasters, Elvis forgetting lyrics, stumbling through performances, barely making it to the final song. But tonight, Elvis had seemed different. He'd been energized during soundcheck, joking with the band, running through songs with genuine enthusiasm. Tonight was supposed to be one of the good nights, and now it was all falling apart. Joe walked into Elvis's dressing room with the producer, Tom Parker Jr., Colonel Parker's nephew, who was handling logistics for this leg of the tour. They explained the situation. The doors were locked, the fans couldn't get in, the technicians estimated at least another 3 hours before they could override the system. By then, it would be nearly midnight. The only reasonable option was to cancel. Elvis listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When they finished explaining, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that nobody expected. "I'm performing tonight." Joe and Tom looked at each other, confused. "Elvis, there's no audience. The arena is empty." "I don't care," Elvis said. "I came here to perform. I got dressed, I warmed up. I'm ready. Those people outside paid money to hear me sing, and I'm going to sing. If they can't come in, then I'll sing to the empty seats. Maybe they'll hear me through the walls. But I'm not canceling." Tom tried to reason with him. "Elvis, it doesn't make sense. Nobody will be there to see you. We can reschedule, do the show properly when the system is fixed." But Elvis was adamant. "How many times have I performed when I wasn't ready? How many shows have I done where I was too sick or too tired or too drugged up to give people what they paid for? How many times have I cheated audiences because I couldn't get my act together? Tonight, I'm ready. Tonight, I actually want to perform, and you're telling me I can't because of a computer malfunction?" There was something in Elvis's voice that Joe recognized. Desperation, but also determination. Elvis needed to perform tonight, not for the audience, not for the money, not for professional obligation. He needed it for himself, to prove something, to connect with something he'd been missing. "Let me do this," Elvis said quietly. "I know it sounds crazy, but I need to do this. I need to remember what it feels like to perform because I want to, not because I have to. I need to sing without worrying about disappointing people or living up to expectations or being Elvis Presley. Just let me sing." Joe looked at Tom, who shrugged helplessly. What could they say? Elvis was the boss. If he wanted to perform for an empty arena, they couldn't stop him. "Okay," Joe said. "We'll tell the band." The band members were confused but willing. They'd followed Elvis through stranger situations than this. If he wanted to play for empty seats, they'd play. The technicians were told to run sound and lights as if it were a normal show. Elvis's backup singers, the sweet inspirations, were brought up to speed. Everyone took their positions. At 8:15 p.m., exactly when the show was scheduled to start, Elvis Presley walked onto the stage of the Portland Memorial Coliseum and looked out at 18,000 empty seats. The lights were on, illuminating the vast emptiness. The sound system hummed with potential energy. And outside, pressed against the locked doors and standing in the rain, thousands of fans who'd paid to be inside were starting to realize the show might not happen. Elvis stood at the microphone for a moment, taking in the surreal scene. Then he turned to the band and nodded. They launched into C.C. Rider, his traditional opening number. Elvis's voice filled the empty arena, powerful and clear, reverberating off the walls and the empty seats. The technicians working on the door lock stopped what they were doing and listened. There was something different about Elvis's voice tonight. It wasn't the practiced, professional sound of someone going through the motions. It was raw, emotional, like Elvis was singing for his life. Elvis moved through his set list, but not the usual one. He was improvising, calling out songs the band hadn't rehearsed, old numbers from his early days, gospel songs that weren't on the planned program. The band scrambled to keep up, but they were grinning. This was exciting. This was unpredictable. This was the Elvis they'd heard about from the old days, before the Vegas residencies and the prescription pills had turned performances into assembly line products. Outside, the crowd was getting restless. Some people were demanding refunds. Others were angry, feeling cheated. But then, someone noticed something. If you stood near the arena walls, you could hear music. Faintly, muffled by concrete and steel, but definitely there. Elvis was performing inside, and the sound was leaking out. Word spread through the crowd. Elvis was singing. They couldn't see him, couldn't get inside, but they could hear him if they got close to the building. Thousands of people pressed against the exterior walls of the Portland Memorial Coliseum, standing in the rain, straining to hear the muffled sound of Elvis Presley performing his heart out for an audience that couldn't see him. Inside, something magical was happening. Elvis was performing without the pressure of audience reaction. There were no screaming fans to please, no expectations to live up to, no comparisons to his younger self. He was just singing, pure and simple, doing what he'd fallen in love with as a teenager in Memphis. Between songs, Elvis talked to the empty arena as if it were full. He told stories, made jokes, shared memories. His backup singers stood on stage trying not to cry because they'd never seen Elvis like this, so unguarded, so genuine, so connected to the music in a way he hadn't been in years. The band was locked in, following Elvis wherever he wanted to go. When he decided to do a 15-minute version of How Great Thou Art, they adapted. When he suddenly launched into That's All Right, his first hit from 1954, they found the groove. When he sat at the piano and played gospel songs for 20 minutes, they accompanied him perfectly. The technical crew stopped working on the doors entirely. They were witnessing something they'd never seen before, and knew they'd never see again. This wasn't the Elvis Presley who struggled through Vegas shows, who forgot lyrics, who seemed lost and disconnected. This was the artist underneath all the dysfunction, the person who'd become famous, not for his looks or his persona, but for his genuine love of music. 2 hours into the performance, Elvis was sweating through his jumpsuit, grinning like a teenager, more alive than anyone had seen him in years. He'd sung 30 songs, told a dozen stories, connected with the empty arena in a way he'd stopped connecting with full ones. And outside, pressed against the cold walls, 18,000 people stood in the rain, listening to muffled music, sharing an experience that nobody would believe when they tried to describe it later. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., Elvis performed his closing number. Not the usual dramatic ending with scarves thrown to fans and final boos. Just a simple, heartfelt performance of Can't Help Falling in Love, sung with such sincerity that several technicians found themselves wiping away tears. When the song ended, Elvis stood at the microphone for a long moment, looking out at the empty seats. Then he said, quietly, speaking to himself as much as anyone, "Thank you. Thank you for letting me remember why I do this." He walked off stage, and the arena fell silent. The band packed up their instruments in awed quietness. The backup singers hugged each other, unable to articulate what they'd just experienced. Joe Esposito stood in the wings, realizing he'd just witnessed the best Elvis performance in years, maybe decades, and there'd been nobody there to see it except the people who worked for him. Backstage, Elvis was euphoric. He was talking rapidly, energized in a way that had nothing to do with pills. Did you feel that? Did you feel the music tonight? That's what it's supposed to be like. That's why I started doing this, not for the money or the fame, for that feeling, for the connection to something bigger than myself. The technical crew finally managed to override the door system around 11 p.m. The fans flooded inside, angry and wet and confused. Tom Parker Jr. took the stage and explained that there'd been a technical malfunction, that the show was canceled, that everyone would receive full refunds and complimentary tickets to a rescheduled performance. But something strange happened. As Tom was making his announcement, people in the crowd started talking to each other, comparing notes. Had they heard music from outside? Was Elvis performing while they were stuck in the rain? Some people swore they'd heard entire songs. Others had caught only fragments. But there was a consensus forming. Elvis Presley had performed tonight, and they'd missed it, but they'd also somehow been part of it, standing in the rain, pressed against the arena walls, connected to the music through concrete and steel. Elvis left Portland the next morning, and nobody talked publicly about what had happened. The official story was that the show had been canceled due to technical difficulties. Refunds were processed. The newspapers reported it as a minor inconvenience. But among Elvis's road crew, among the technicians who'd been there, among the backup singers and band members, the story of that night became legendary. They called it the Empty Arena Show, and in private conversations, they would always say it was the best performance they'd ever seen Elvis give. He wasn't performing for applause or money, said guitarist James Burton in a 1982 interview. He was performing for himself, for the music. That's the Elvis I'd heard about from the 1950s. For one night in Portland, that Elvis came back. The Sweet Inspirations' Myrna Smith talked about it in her 1995 memoir. Elvis sang that night like he was trying to save his own life, like the music was the only thing that mattered. He was free that night in a way I never saw him free before or after. The 18,000 fans who stood outside in the rain had their own story to tell. Over the years, the legend grew. People who'd been there would swear they'd heard entire concerts through the walls. The experience of standing in the rain, knowing Elvis was inside performing, had been powerful anyway. The Portland Empty Arena Show became a musical myth, verified by enough witnesses that it can't be dismissed. It represented something important about Elvis that often got lost in discussions of his decline. Underneath all the dysfunction, Elvis genuinely loved music. He'd become famous because he'd found a way to channel something authentic through his voice. And on that April night in Portland, when a technical failure gave him permission to perform without expectations, that authentic connection came flooding back. It's telling that Elvis's best performance in years happened when nobody could see it. He'd spent so long trying to be Elvis Presley that he'd forgotten how to just be himself. The empty arena gave him freedom from judgment, from comparison, from the weight of history. Elvis died 2 years later without ever publicly acknowledging the Portland show. It remained a secret story, a reminder that even in his darkest period, Elvis was still capable of moments of pure artistry. The fans who stood outside in the rain got refunds and tickets to the rescheduled show 3 months later. That performance was fine, professional, exactly what you'd expect from an Elvis concert in 1975. But people who'd been at both shows would always say the one they remembered, the one that meant something, was the one they'd listened to through concrete walls, the one where Elvis sang to an empty arena and reminded himself why he'd started singing in the first place. Today, no recording exists of that Portland performance. It wasn't documented because it wasn't supposed to happen. All that remains are memories and testimonies, stories told by people who were there, who witnessed Elvis Presley at his most vulnerable and most powerful. The night when 18,000 people paid for tickets but couldn't get inside. The night when Elvis performed anyway, for himself and the music, proving that his gift was real even when everything else in his life was falling apart. The empty arena in Portland wasn't a tragedy. It was a gift. A moment when technical failure created space for artistic purity. A night when the most famous entertainer in the world got to remember what it felt like to perform without the weight of being Elvis Presley, without the expectations of millions, without the burden of legend and myth and declining health. And for everyone who was there, either inside witnessing it directly or outside hearing fragments through the walls in the cold April rain, it was proof that greatness isn't about perfect circumstances or ideal audiences or sold-out shows. Sometimes it's about showing up and doing what you love, even when nobody's watching, especially then, because that's when truth appears. The Portland Coliseum doors were locked that April night in 1975, but in doing so, they unlocked something in Elvis, the pure artist buried under fame and pills. For 2 hours he was free, remembered who he was, and those who heard even a fragment witnessed the real Elvis Presley.